Hello and welcome to Creating a Human Rights Culture, which aims to promote a lived awareness of the interdependency and indivisibility of human rights principles in our minds, hearts, and bodies, that is, dragged into our everyday lives. What, after all, is freedom of speech to a person who is homeless and lives in a world at war? Therefore, it is dedicated ultimately to the application of the human rights triptych, which in brief consists of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at its center, the conventions, that is, international treaties on the right, and implementation measures on the left.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Joseph Wronka, and welcome to another episode of Creating a Human Rights Culture, which calls for a lived awareness of human rights in our minds and our hearts, and integrated into our everyday lives. Today what I want to talk about is a report by the United Nations on how the United States of America is doing in regard to the situation of Indigenous peoples. This report is a report that was responding to a major human rights convention which the United States ratified. And once a convention is ratified, it has the status of treaty and must be followed, and the judges bound thereby according to Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. So I have about 17 slides, so I hope you'll bear with me, and I'm going to talk about these major concerns. This report was done in August of 2022, and in 5 years, the United States has to respond again to tell the United Nations how they're doing. Before I get going, I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself. Like it says in the slide there, I hope you could see it. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work and Behavioral Sciences at Springfield College. I'm also representative to the United Nations for the International Association of Schools of Social Work, IASSW. I'm also on the executive committee of the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I lived in the Arctic of Alaska for a number of years, and I worked with the Indigenous Peoples Coalition in Geneva. So when I was working with the Inupiat, I don't know, I just felt that we need to pay more attention to the issues of Indigenous peoples in the United States. Of course, we also have to take into consideration Black Lives Matter. We must stop Asian hate. Everything is related. We have to engage in coalition building. But today I want to talk about the plight of Indigenous peoples. I had given this presentation at a recent meeting of the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but I honed this for Amherst Media, and I'm going to get into these slides today. Furthermore, another reason why I'm doing this on Indigenous peoples is because, hope you can see that, August 9th is the International Day of Indigenous Peoples. This was a day back in 1982 when the United Nations formed the first working group on the rights of Indigenous peoples worldwide, which would include substantively their right to self-determination, which means, in brief, that cultural groups such as Indigenous peoples have the right to carve their own destiny. I don't know, governments seem to be a little afraid of this. I don't know why. But in Mohawk, the right to self-determination simply means living nicely together. Oh yeah, I forgot I'm also an author, and there's a little poster on my book. This is the book I've recently written. Well, actually, it's the third edition of a book called Human Rights and Social Justice, Social Action and Service for the Helping and Health Professions. The third edition recently came out by Cognella Press. And if you want further information about human rights and also my book, you can go to www.humanrightsculture.org, or you can go to the link to my book, Human Rights and Social Justice for short. Simply go to www.titles.cognella.com and put my name in the upper left. Of course, you can get the book on Amazon, but apparently it's a little cheaper at Cognella. It's a 550-page academic book, and it's, I believe, $44, something like that. By the way, if you're an instructor, it also comes with an instructor's manual, PowerPoints. In fact, this PowerPoint actually is there. So, so without further ado, let me go on. And before I get into the concerns, I think that my audience, and this was in the brief intro, you should know about what's called the human rights triptych. What is the human rights triptych? At the center, you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Pope John Paul II, remember him? He said this is the milestone in a long and difficult struggle of the human race. It consists of 5 crucial notions: human dignity, non-discrimination, civil and political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, economic, social, and cultural rights, rights to health care, rights to shelter, rights to a job, and solidarity rights, which means governments must cooperate. So we're talking here about the right to peace, the right to a clean environment. Following the Universal Declaration, on the right panel are conventions, declarations, and guiding principles. Hey, look at, I can't get into a whole course in this 1 hour or so, but let me just briefly say, you have a number of conventions. You have the Convention on Civil Rights. You have another convention, if you follow down on the slide here, on the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination mentioned before, which talks about eradicating racism. There's another one, CEDAW, and that talks about eliminating discrimination against women. There's another one on children, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there's another one on torture called the CAT, Convention Against Torture. And there's another one called CESCAR, I like that name, the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I don't know, I'm having problems seeing the slide, but there's another convention on enforced disappearances, saying that no government can steal people in the middle of the night and kill them. Unfortunately, you gotta do these things. Now look at, what I'm gonna emphasize today is CERD, C-E-R-D, because it is one of the most relevant conventions that talks about discrimination against various groups. Actually, about last year, I had a colleague, friend, Dr. Calvin Hill from Springfield College, who came here, and we spoke about concluding observations in terms of how the United States discriminates against people of African heritage, African American heritage, and how social justice struggle. What can I say? So that was Black Lives Matter last year, which is important. Today I'm looking at Indigenous lives. Social justice struggle. That's all I have to say. If you look at that slide, we're going to emphasize CERD. Now if you look at the left here, there are implementation measures. I have in bold reports to conventions monitoring committees. So I'm going to look at the report that the United Nations had to the United States, telling them in more ways than one how to get their act together. Of course, they don't say, hey, look at you guys, you got to get your act together. They're much nicer. They simply say, these are some concerns we have, and we'd like to engage in a creative dialogue. I'll get into this. They say things like, we thank you for acknowledging the legacies of colonialism and imperialism in your culture, and that you acknowledge that, well, the United States does. It acknowledges that, hey, it's not very nice to indigenous peoples. They acknowledge that, and they're basically asking for help. But if you look at the left, the implementation measures, I'm going to talk about those reports. There are other things. I can't get into this. We got to move on. There's thematic reports on violence in a country or racism in a country. There's universal periodic review, special rapporteurs, world conferences, follow-up on world conferences, and NGO input. In my book, for example, they had a special rapporteur on extreme poverty in the United States, and I have a PowerPoint on that. Maybe I can come back and we could do that. But I just want to emphasize indigenous peoples for today. Capiche, like my mother used to say, with me, guys, and gals, whatever. Okay, everyone, so here are suggested links that you should click on to get to human rights mechanisms. You should go to, there's a big URL, www.ohchr.org. Then it has /en/about-us/High Commissioner. Fine. What you got to do is enter the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Okay? And then when you get to the page, go to Instruments and Mechanisms, go to Treaty Bodies, and then in this instance, you should go to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, then insert the country of concern. In this instance, what I did, I inserted the United States. I don't like to say America because it's a form of imperialism. If you want my personal opinion, it is the United States of the Americas. So don't go to A, go to U for United States, or any other country you're interested in. Then go to Concluding Observations, insert Indigenous Peoples, and then see what you get. Or when you go to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, simply enter your country of interest, and then you could navigate from there. Come on, you guys are no dopes. You can just navigate. It'll say Indigenous Peoples. It might say people of African descent. You could basically figure that out. So here we are, everyone, concluding observations of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Committee to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD. The acronym is CERD, C-E-R-D, to the United States of America. Actually, it's the United States of the Americas, but I could deal with this. And these are select matters as pertaining to indigenous issues. These are simply select matters. Quite honestly, they were chosen rather arbitrarily. I can't do everything. And I wanted to get this show done in about an hour or so. Otherwise, we would be here for, 2-3 hours. So these are some select issues that, they were arbitrarily chosen, but I think they were still important. Now, this report by the United Nations was submitted in August 2022. Everyone who's listening, I want you to know that every 5 years, country submits reports. So, in 2027, the United Nations is going to see, how is the United States doing? There are tremendous missing children, for example, on so-called not united, but on reservations. Well, they used to be prisoners of war camps, but that's another issue. And we brought to their attention all the missing children and how are you doing. So this is August 2022. So in 2027, we're going to see how they are doing. Now, I just want to make some comments. This document, CERD, C-E-R-D, was ratified in 1994. I believe it was the Clinton administration. It is a progeny of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In other words, it's kind of a child of sorts. It also has the status of international treaty with its own monitoring committee, which is what I'm going to get into here. Now, this convention, CERD, C-E-R-D, is a treaty. Now, a lot of people don't know this, and I studied constitutional law. I mean, nobody talks about this, but Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution is referred to as the Supremacy Clause, and it says that any treaty, once ratified by a country, and especially in this instance, the United States, shall become the law of the land, and the judges bound thereby. So CERD, which talks about eliminating racial discrimination, literally says racism is against the law. Could you believe that? Racism against the law in this country? I mean, I think we are getting a little better, but we got a long way to go. I don't know, our Constitution talks about it has an equal protection clause. I don't know, I just don't think it goes far enough. But I just wanted to say, when the United States ratified CERD, C-E-R-D, I think this is the 12th time I said it, they ratified it with the stipulation that it be non-self-executing. In other words, it was only a symbolic measure. I think that's rather shameful, but I don't know, kind of a creative compromise. They got to do something to get this through the Senate, so that's what they did. Now look I teach social policy. Okay, my doctorate's from Brandeis, whatever. And I've had a number of courses, and a lot of people say, well, the United Nations doesn't have any implementation mechanisms, and I don't know what people mean by that. What, are they supposed to drop bombs on people and say, don't be a racist bigot? I don't think it works like that. What does work is getting the facts out there, getting the information out there, and then having people make up their own minds. Hey, that makes sense. And I think what we're going to get into now, I think I have about 11 slides left. We are going to, I'm just going to describe what the United Nations said are issues pertaining to Indigenous people. Just listen, make up your own mind, and see what we can do. Okay, here we go. So, I'm just going to get into concerns. I'm going to read these as they are on the slide, and I'm going to make comments here and there. I guess you could say higgledy-piggledy, but I don't know. So the first thing the United Nations was concerned about, and this was done in 2022, remember, was that there is a significant increase of hate crimes, including mass shootings against racial and ethnic minorities and non-citizens, in particular people of African descent, Indigenous peoples, persons of Hispanic, Latino origin, and Asian descent, and ethno-religious communities, including hate crimes on the internet by politicians and public figures. Hey, look at guys, you can do this same thing. Like I said, go to the website for the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and simply enter any group that you want to put in. What I did, I entered the word Indigenous Peoples, the words Indigenous Peoples, and then I simply see what they had to say, and I put them in the slides. The first point I would like to make is that you notice where they talk in the same breath, so to speak, of people of African descent, Indigenous peoples, Hispanic, Latino origin, and Asian descent. The basic point is that there eventually needs to be some kind of coalition building. Martin Luther King, for example, he was obviously an advocate of eradicating racism, but he also was very, very much in support of Indigenous people, whom he thought were extremely treated poorly. And while it's kind of a paradox, while we have to look at the importance of self-determination for Indigenous peoples, we also have to look at the self-determinations of people of African descent and Hispanic, Latino origin, and so on. Social justice is struggle. That's all there is to it. Okay, we can't stop until everyone has human rights. Every person everywhere on the planet has their human rights fulfilled. So the report continues. There's a substantial increase of gun-related deaths and injuries, disproportionately affecting racial and ethnic minorities, particularly people of African descent, Indigenous peoples, and persons of Hispanic, Latino origin. It goes on. There is an excessive or deadly use of force by law enforcement officials against members of racial and ethnic minorities, including against unarmed individuals, which has a disparate impact on people of African descent, Indigenous peoples, persons of Hispanic, Latino origin, and Asian descent, on undocumented immigrants. There is also an excessive use of force when Indigenous peoples are protesting in defense of their rights. I know Amherst Media shows Democracy Now!, and for those of you that have seen Democracy Now!, you have seen dogs being sicked on protesters, simply wanting water, clean water for their land. And, you know, this is totally absurd, and it's an excessive use of force. But, like I say in my classes, sicking dogs on Indigenous peoples has a long, long history. I recommend that people read David Stannard's American Holocaust. They would just, the conquistadors, whatever you call them, would just have groups of dogs just going after Indigenous peoples. Okay, what are some other concerns? There's an increase in legislative measures and policies that effectively constrain the exercise of the right to vote, with a disproportionate impact on people of African descent, Indigenous peoples, persons of Hispanic, Latino origin, and other ethnic minorities, such as burdensome voter identification requirements, substantial restrictions on early voting, voting by mail, and absentee ballots. And I'm sure you've seen the long lines just to vote. And my impression was the long lines in minority communities. So that's a big problem. Let's go on. In the juvenile justice system, there is an overrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities, particularly children of African descent and Indigenous children in the juvenile justice system, and they're being prosecuted as adults and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole in some cases. I was reading once in the Christian Science Monitor, I think it was early 2000s, whatever. I think that paper actually folded, maybe because it was kind of radical at times, but it said there, as I recall, there were something like 10 countries where children, those under 18 who committed a crime, were eligible for life imprisonment without parole. And what it said was, of all the other 9 countries, the United States had double the amount of all those 9 combined. So there's a problem, and a lot of them were indigenous and of African descent. The report also said people from racial and ethnic minority communities, indigenous peoples, and non-citizens have been more vulnerable and disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Okay, we'll go on. There is persistent racial and socioeconomic school segregation and racial disparities in academic achievement which disproportionately affect indigenous peoples. Indigenous students also receive harsher disciplinary sentences and arrests in school for minor non-violent offenses. So it's a pretty serious issue. There is a limited availability of culturally sensitive and respectful maternal health care, including midwifery, or is it wifery? I don't know, care for low-income, rural, and people of African descent and indigenous communities. There is an increasing number of state and local laws that criminalize homelessness, and at the disproportionately high number of persons belonging to racial and ethnic minorities affected by homelessness, in particular people of African descent, indigenous peoples, and persons of Hispanic, Latino origin, including women and LGBTQ. I left out the Q for some reason, persons. There is also a disproportionate impact of food insecurity on racial and ethnic minorities and indigenous peoples, in particular persons of African descent and of Hispanic Latino origin, particularly women and children from these communities, due to, among other factors, disparate poverty and unemployment rates among these communities, racial wage disparities, and legislation and practices with the discriminatory effect on the tenure and the use of the land. The disproportionate health, socioeconomic, and cultural impact of pollution, climate change, and natural disasters on racial and ethnic minorities and indigenous peoples caused by extractive and manufacturing industries such as petrochemical facilities and methanol complexes, as for instance in the case of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and by radioactive and toxic waste. Let me just say a little bit about radioactive and toxic waste. When I lived in Alaska, there's a little town of Point Hope, and some kids were playing there, and all of a sudden they ran across these barrels that later were found out to be filled with radioactive waste materials. I have to roll my eyes. I mean, why not sort of just put him in a small Eskimo or Inupiat village? I don't know. The whole thing was bizarre. And all of this is in the public forum. The New York Times did an article on that. Plus, when I lived in Alaska, some dentists said, true story, that they didn't have to x-ray their teeth. They simply got the film, I don't know what they use now, but in those days they used to use film, put it on their teeth, and they could see cavities, whatever's going on in their gums. They were already radioactive. Now, how did that come about? If you remember back in the 50s and 60s, 70s to some extent, I don't know precisely what they were, but they would have all these atomic tests. The radiation would go up into the sky. It would fall down on the lichen in the Arctic, subarctic regions of Alaska and Canada. And the caribou would eat the lichen, and then the indigenous people would eat the caribou, and then it would go up the food chain. It's going to be very interesting. The movie Oppenheimer is coming out tomorrow, and I'd like to see how they talk about indigenous people. I mean, I don't know, it was, the Manhattan Project took place in New Mexico, and I mean, did they ask indigenous people, is it okay that we use indigenous land to develop the atom bomb? I mean, you know, your hair might fall out, you might get all kinds of problems with your blood, and I don't know, did they ask them? I wonder if that's even touched upon, and I wonder how Oppenheimer felt about that, because there's all this data that basically says indigenous people continue to suffer because of the Manhattan Project. To go on, the adverse effects of economic activities by transnational corporations registered in the State Party in the United States on the rights and way of life of minority groups and indigenous peoples in other countries. There's a lot of examples of this. One of the examples, well, you guys are young, but there was the Bhopal incident in the 80s, and this chemical corporation, I believe it was Union Carbide, just kind of exploded, and a lot of people had all kinds of respiratory problems. Their lives were cut short, and I've been to India a number of times. The legacies of the Bhopal incident are still there. There is a lot of other instances. I don't know. I hate to say this. I mentioned Pope John Paul II before, but he said at one point, Americans are out for themselves. I don't know. These transnational corporations, I mean, I never voted for them to put chemicals in water, and apparently many of the aquifers in India were ruined by Coca-Cola. Don't turn me in, please, Coca-Cola, apparently, I said. And I don't know, I wonder if John Paul II has a point. Nelson Mandela said similar things. Whatever. There is a persistent, disproportionate number of women from racial and ethnic minorities, particularly indigenous women, migrant women, and women of African descent who are victims of violence, including sexual violence. In light of the Supreme Court's decision in Oklahoma versus Castro Huerta of the 29th of June, 2022, the committee reiterates its concern that indigenous women are denied the right to access for justice and to obtain reparation. Okay, so there was a special section in that report on indigenous peoples. Before I simply scrolled down, I put the word indigenous peoples, enter, and but there's a special section on indigenous peoples, and it came out with these 5 concerns. And it basically told the United States, actually thank them for acknowledging the legacy of the negative impacts of colonialism on indigenous peoples who continue to be victims of its consequences. And I also teach in a school of social work, School of Social Work and Behavioral Sciences, and it's very interesting. Our accrediting agency, the Council on Social Work Education, apologized at one point for its treatment of Indigenous peoples, and I don't know, basically saying it was a result of colonialism. I thought that was cool. But let's go look. So these are the 5 things that the CERD committee, I think this is the 14th time I said it, had expressed concerns. They said that you should be concerned about the lack of measures that was taken by the United States to honor the bilateral treaties entered with Indigenous peoples and the lack of consultation with their implementation. They told the United States, could you please look at many of the obstacles for the recognition of Indigenous peoples? It's extremely expensive. There's all kinds of burdensome procedures, bureaucracy. They also asked the United States, you seem to have a restrictive interpretation of the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and the lack of timely and meaningful consultations with Indigenous peoples. And that is damn straight. You know, I've gone to Geneva a number of times. It's like it's all over the place. I mean, like I said before, I wonder if that's going to be in the movie. Did they ask Indigenous people, is it okay to build the atom bomb here? I mean, your streams might be polluted forever. I don't know. But I don't think they did that. Like I say, I've been to Geneva, and I hear a lot of Indigenous peoples. They say things like, take all the islands off the Georgia coast. I think it's Jekyll Island, and there's a couple of others. They said all of a sudden we were just overrun by hotels and this and that, and nobody asked the Indigenous people who were there, the Ga and the Geechee, whatever. They also asked the United States that they should look at their extractive industries, their infrastructure projects, border walls and fences, as exemplified by the situations regarding the situations of the Western Shoshone, Native Hawaiians, the Gwich'in, and Anishinaabe Indigenous peoples. There's tremendous mining going on there, and you know, they just, what's the other one? Oil. What is it called? I forget where they extract the oil from the sand. And then they told the United States there's lack of adequate measures and funding to address missing and murdered Indigenous children. Now again, a lot of this can be found in my book, the 3rd edition of my book that just came out. And you could find more information on some of my work. You could just go to humanrightsculture.org, and I hope to have these slides up by the end of the weekend. And you can also order my book, Human Rights and Social Justice, Social Action and Service for the Helping and Health Professions. I have a link there. And by the way, I forgot to tell you, if you enter at checkout author 20, you get a 20% discount. I got to hand it to Cognella Press. I just asked them very nicely, could you keep the price down for my students? So what they did, they said, yeah. I mean, it's $45 for a 550-page book. And if you enter author 20 at the checkout, you'll get 20% off. So that's like $36 for the book. And let me just conclude. Here is a sculpture of my childhood hero, Crazy Horse. I say he was my childhood hero. Do you remember in the 6th grade how you have to do a report on a famous person? I don't know if social justice or social work was in my blood. I have no idea, but I felt bad for the Indians. Actually, I still do. I feel bad for them. I mean, they're, the cavalry's there with guns and rifles, and they're there with bows and arrows. I also felt bad for the guy that blew the trumpet when they're charging, but that's another story. But I felt bad for the Indians, so I wanted to do a book on a famous person, so I chose Crazy Horse. I wrote the book and the report, and I was very proud. I handed it in to the teacher, and he told me, "Who cares about Crazy Horse?" That's the way it was back in the 60s, was it? So, tough. I care about Crazy Horse. They have a monument to him, and the spirit of Crazy Horse should be our guiding principle for social policies, for social actions to create a socially just world constructed from the pillars of human rights. And what is the spirit of Crazy Horse? I will tell you what it is, and I will end on that notion, that idea, or the concept of what the spirit of Crazy Horse is, and that is peace, humility, and everlasting love. Thanks everyone for your time. Hope to see you in 5 years from now, and to see how the United States responded to these United Nations concerns. Ciao.